This episode is sponsored by yet another incredible company that I stand behind fully, and that is Bubs Naturals. Now, I've not only used Bubs products for 4 years now, but I've also had the founder, Sean Lake, on the show twice. And they are offering you, the audience of the Behind the Shield podcast, 20% off your entire order, and I will give you that code in a moment. Now, Bubs has a very powerful backstory. Glenn Bub Doherty is one of the 2 Navy SEALs killed protecting the CIA facility in Benghazi. And wanting to honor his best friend, Sean stood up this company. Now, it began with their flagship product, which is their collagen. And I have to say, as a Brit with really dry skin who's now 51, I cannot underline the importance of collagen in your diet. I have seen a huge positive impact on my skin, nails, hair, and most importantly, digestive system. Another thing that I use religiously is their MCT creamers. That's the part of coconut oil that is good for our brain. And they come in dairy and non-dairy, depending on your diet. Now, I started taking Bub's latest product, creatine, about 3 months ago. And that was primarily because it's been proven to improve cognition and brain health. But not only did I witness that, I also saw an improvement in my performance, my lean muscle mass, and even a reduction in inflammation and sports injury pain. Now, in addition, Bubs makes apple cider vinegar gummies, vitamin C, and their hydration product, Hydrate or Die. And several of these products are also NSF certified, which is the highest level of certification as far as efficacy and cleanliness. Now, one of the most important elements of this company, in my opinion, is that they are a social business, meaning 10% of their profits go to charity, and in this case, it is the Glenn Doherty Foundation. Now, as I mentioned before, they are offering you, the audience of the Behind the Shield podcast, 20% off your entire order if you use the code BTS at bubsnaturals.com. And if you want to hear more about the products, the backstory, and how Sean used Glenn's story to help other veterans, listen to episodes 558 and 1055 of the Behind the Shield podcast. Welcome to the Behind the Shield podcast. As always, my name is James Gearing, and this week it is my absolute honor to welcome on the show veteran California firefighter, psychologist, and volunteer for the Coming Home Project, Kelly Lucas. Now, in this conversation, we discuss a host of topics, from his journey into the fire service, his exposure to CrossFit, his powerful sobriety journey, porn addiction, his Parkinson's disease diagnosis, the healing power of psychedelics, and so much more. Now, before we get to this incredible conversation, as I say every week, please just take a moment. Go to whichever app you listen to this on, subscribe to the show, leave feedback, and leave a rating. Every single 5-star rating truly does elevate this podcast, therefore making it easier for others to find. And this is a free library of almost 1,300 episodes now. So all I ask in return is that you help share these incredible men and women's stories so I can get them to every single person on planet Earth who needs to hear them. So with that being said, I introduce to you Kelly Lucas. Enjoy. Well, Kelly, I want to start by saying thank you so much for taking the time and coming on the Behind the Shield podcast today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, James. Been listening to you, I think from the very beginning when I was still working as a firefighter, and big impact on my life and my career. So it's an honor to be here.
Well, it's an honor to have someone that goes that far back. That's almost 10 years now. So you're an OG. All right. Firstly, where on planet Earth are we finding you today?
I live in Carlsbad, California, in North County, San Diego.
So not too far. When I lived in Huntington Beach, I worked for Anaheim. You were, I think, what, like an hour south of me? Not even that, I think.
Yeah. So pretty close.
So now let's start at the beginning of your journey. So tell me where you were born and tell me a little bit about your family dynamic, what your parents did, how many siblings.
Okay. To back up with my parents a little bit, both my parents grew up in Downey, California, which is a suburb of Los Angeles. They were high school sweethearts. They both went to undergraduate school at UC Santa Barbara. From there, my dad was accepted to MIT in Boston to get his master's and went on to get his PhD in nuclear engineering. So they moved to Boston, where I was born. And I was born in the last year of his graduate work. And then they moved back to Santa Barbara. My dad took on a professor position at UC Santa Barbara and grew up in a little town called Goleta, which is right next to Santa Barbara, where the university and airport is. I grew up with two younger brothers, Ryan and Shannon, all Irish names, which I think from our family history and then the Boston influence while my parents were there.
Talk to me about life in Santa Barbara. I went there, I think twice, and it was absolutely beautiful. The foundation training founder, Eric Goodman, was holding some workshops there while he lived there. What was a childhood in Santa Barbara like?
I probably took it for granted, like my kids do now in Carlsbad, until you move away and have something to compare it to. But it's a beautiful location right on the coast of the Pacific Ocean, and then the mountains are close by. So a lot of beach activities, but then a lot of stuff to do in the mountains. Grew up hiking, camping up there, did a little bit of rock climbing with a friend. So it was really an idyllic place to be raised. And yeah, then moved to school at UC San Diego, and it wasn't a far departure. So I have a narrow temperature range that I can survive in.
What about sports and exercise? You mentioned climbing, some outdoor activities. What else were you playing and doing around the school age?
Interesting history there. I grew up playing sports. My parents always had us involved with sports, soccer, baseball in middle school. Never really enjoyed it. Played golf with my dad, my brother, and my grandfather. Played golf my first year in high school and hated it. It was always something fun I did with my family, and here I was playing with other high schoolers who were wrapping their clubs around trees and in anger and frustration, and so I quit. And the next year I decided, well, if I'm going to do something competitive, I'll play football. And played football my sophomore, junior, senior year of high school, and really enjoyed that and the friendships and the camaraderie I made.
Did you have any notable head traumas when you look back?
Oh yeah. And I mean, I played offensive line, so there was helmet to helmet contact every play, and then went on and played rugby in college for 3 years with no helmet, which I still love that game to this day. But even playing rugby, I remember we came up for a tournament in Santa Barbara, and I tackled the guy more like he ran me over, and I hung on. But we went head to head, and I remember getting up, and I could only see in blue and green for like 5 minutes. And I remember relaying that to a doctor or a neurologist later, and he said, I think that probably counts as a concussion, even though you weren't diagnosed. But yeah, probably a lot of head trauma with 6 years of contact sports.
What about career aspirations? What were you dreaming of becoming when you were in the high school?
I didn't have my heart or head set on in anything in high school. I was a good student. I did well. I was more geared towards science. it's interesting looking back because I remember looking at a career day in high school, and you got to pick the different sections you went to. And I remember I did one in medicine, one maybe in engineering, one in kind of science. The guy talked about like chemical sampling and recon. And I forget what the fourth was, but looking at the fire service later, the other one I think was construction. And going on to the fire service, I was able to do all those things through, hazmat, USAR, some emergency medicine. So it's no wonder I was attracted to that later with such a mix of things you can do in the fire service.
I've told the story on a few times here, and then more so when I'm a guest on someone else's podcast. But when I was young, I wanted to be a firefighter, a doctor, and a stuntman. And I ended up doing stunts, which is a side thing. But I mean, what are we really doing? We're doing real life stunts.
Yeah.
But yeah, the version of a doctor that I ultimately discovered I'd always wanted to be, even though I didn't know that existed when I was a little boy, was a paramedic. It wasn't sitting behind a desk writing prescriptions. It was being out in the streets saving lives. So it is, the fire/EMS that we have here, in the US and Canada, in Dublin, ironically, in Ireland, that most of the world will never understand that vast skill set that we get to try and master throughout a career, and just how many of those boxes you get to check.
Absolutely.
So talk to me then about, you have these exposures to the career day. How does that lead you to the fire service specifically?
So went on to school in UC San Diego, in La Jolla, and originally was a biophysics major. Took my first physics class. There were juniors and seniors in it that had failed it the first time around. I thought physics was interesting. Took atomic and nuclear physics, which I had some idea of with Einstein's work and relativity, but that was week one, and then it just took off from there, and it was just not my jam. So switched to biochemistry through the chemistry department. Bio department was pretty impacted with pre-med students, and started to think about medicine. I liked science. I liked working with people, and that seemed like a good fit. But I went from doing well in high school, graduating with over a 4.0 GPA, and then you're thrown in with a lot of people with the same background. So the competition is way stiffer. So I did okay in college, but probably not good enough to get into medical school. So graduated and took the MCAT right after I graduated. And then I had an older fraternity brother who had gone on and become a paramedic in Texas, not as a career, but as something to do post graduating college. So I talked to him, and I decided maybe I'll be an EMT for a year to get some medical experience while I apply to medical schools. So right after I graduated, I took a crash course studying for the MCAT. And then literally the next week after I was done with that, I went to an EMT program through UCLA, which started the Daniel Freeman paramedic program way back when. It was kind of a offshoot of that. So became an EMT in 2 weeks, long days, just sped through it, and then moved up to San Francisco, where some older fraternity brothers had moved, and worked as an EMT. And through being an EMT, I started to find out about the fire department. And the more I learned, and the more I could see that I could do, the more attractive it became. And just to tell a quick story with that. So during that time up in San Francisco, I started talking to as many medical doctors and firefighters as I could, and just wanted to know about their careers. And I'd always ask him at the end, would you go back and do this again? And I only found 2 medical doctors that said they'd go back and do it again. And many of them liked their jobs, but they had just such a huge sacrifice to get there, both money wise, being in debt afterwards, huge amount of time to get there. I mean, that's all they were focused on for many years. And one of those 2 firefighters was a friend of my parents that was, I think, hoping that I would pursue medicine. And then flip side of that, every firefighter, when asked if they go back to, if they do it again, they said, yeah, hell yeah, I'd go back and do it again. And as you and I both know, the fire service has changed even in the last 20, 30 years. And that's a tougher question to answer now, even for me. But that was pretty telling back then that every firefighter was definitely into it.
I want to move forward in the career side, but just before we do, if you turn back and reflect backwards to your early years, knowing that so many of us that wear a uniform were called to it because of things that happened when we were younger, and then we're obviously going to talk about your mental health journey as well. When you reflect back now with the 2026 lens, what, if any, were the elements of struggles or trauma that you had as a young man before you put the uniform on?
Gosh, I was not aware of any of them when I was that age, in my young 20s. And I think through the medicine work I've done, it's uncovered a lot of those things, which I wasn't even aware of. And I think that's important because I think a lot of times we look at childhood, early childhood, and then we look at adulthood, and we attribute a lot of stuff to childhood trauma. But then I don't think there's enough of a investigation on kind of that era when you're in your 20s or early 20s, when the brain is still developing and you're still experiencing trauma, because that's where some of them came, with my mom drinking and her changing quite a bit. That was in my early 20s when I was in college, and I didn't recognize that until later.
See, I think this is such an important conversation. Firstly, because when people go into a counselor's office, a psychedelic retreat, whatever it is, understanding that it may not be the calls you saw on an ambulance or a fire engine or a police car, that it may well be your formative years. And as we know, most of the people that go in, that's, the what I call the pea beneath the mattress, the origin. But it also, if you flip it around, then becomes a really encouraging conversation, because if you and I, now we're 22 and we're standing on the drill ground of our first fire department, and someone gets up in front of you and us and says, the fact that you are here means you've been through some shit. And that is an amazing thing. But if it's left unaddressed and buried down, that will be a detriment to your career, and it will be a fracture to your foundation. But just like we're going to, train your body during the next 12 weeks of orientation, we're also going to address your mind, and we're going to allow you to perform at a higher level, because we're going to use tools like meditation and breath work and, all the other things, so that we can work through whatever has brought you here and use it now as a superpower, as a strength. So I think that as we have evolved and really started to understand this, we can now front load that conversation at day one of an academy and be like, there's only, you're 1% of the population that showed up today. There's a reason why that you are unique. There's a reason why you're here. And it may not be apparent to you yet, but if we start having these conversations from day one, if we give you X amount of counseling sessions of which you can just talk about the weather, or you can talk about something a lot deeper, now we're forging a higher level of performance and a higher chance of a pseudo flow state when you are now, responding to these life or death emergencies.
Totally agree, James. And I'm so glad you bring this point up time and time again. And I think of that day one in the academy. I mean, what if they asked us, who are you trying to rescue? Well, I'm trying to rescue that guy inside, or whoever you tell me to, sir. And it's like, no, you're unconsciously, you're probably trying to rescue someone else. Maybe it's yourself.
Maybe you're just trying to be good enough, air quotes, for your mother, your father, yourself, and understanding, again, as I've had so many conversations, that if you're doing it for external validation, it will never be enough. I tell you right now, even my own personal experience, it will never be enough. So do it for you. Do it so that you are proud of yourself.
Yeah, you bet.
So as an EMT in San Francisco, you've come from this engineering background, this engineering family. What were some of the calls that you started seeing behind this kind of curtain of society that a lot of people don't ever get to peek behind?
It's interesting you bring that up. I was just talking to a sheriff friend of mine this last week and talking about how we were raised, because he started his career. I think he was 21 when he was put in the jails in Orange County, and how eye-opening it was to him. And I was telling him about moving up to San Francisco from after growing up in Santa Barbara and working in some very interesting neighborhoods, and just the gamut of people exposed to. San Francisco is such a melting pot of cultures and class levels, and the impoverished to the ultra wealthy and everything in between. Unfortunately, I spent a lot of time doing hospital transports as an EMT, of moving people from one place to another, which is not what I was expecting. And that was not super interesting. But the days I had a paramedic partner, those days were fun, because we were placed into the 911 system along with San Francisco Fire. A notable call, and this was a transport from a hospital to a hospital. We used to take this woman, and she wasn't quite all there. And I learned from her history of seeing her several times. She was going to this other hospital to receive electroshock therapy in her brain. And this was in 2000 or 2001. And I thought, wow, this is still going on. This is like something out of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And the story was that she had been kidnapped by a cult or something in Berkeley, and was sexually assaulted multiple times, and they were trying to erase her memory. And, growing up from where I did, and the friends and relatively stable family, and then being exposed to people just with just incomprehensible trauma is pretty eye-opening. I mean, it still is to me this day as a counselor of what people have endured. It's just heartbreaking.
I can't remember which firefighter it was, but I had someone on the show, and it was the same thing. That was their entrance to medicine was, I can't remember if they were an EMT, but they were assigned to a psych facility. That's where they found themselves. And yeah, they would go room to room with a little shock machine. And it's interesting, because if you hear, as we've been told to reiterate a few years ago now, trust the science. It's like, okay, well, then it's good to question the science too, because that's what people used to believe was the cure to mental health.
Right.
And here we are having
science is always changing.
Exactly. An interesting San Francisco story. My wife was in med school the last few years, and when I was down there, we went out to dinner one night, and responsibly we got an Uber there and an Uber back, so we had some wine. And on the way back, this absolute sweetheart of a gentleman was our Uber driver. He was kind of older, black guy, and he was from San Francisco. He's gay as well. And we had such a deep conversation with him that when we got to her apartment, we sat in the parking lot and kept talking. all of a sudden our phones go off, with a "Are you being murdered?" notification from Uber. He got the same thing. And it was just because we were talking. But in this conversation, he said the homelessness was so bad in San Francisco because the cost of living was so ridiculous that it was so easy to fall into the poverty line versus, maybe some rural place where I am in Florida. What were you seeing as far as the homelessness and the contributing factors of that in somewhere as affluent as the Northern California area?
I think I've been present for a long time. That was early 2000s that I was there. And I think it got worse after I left because I know the crime rate went way up in San Francisco as well. And I think throughout California, we see a lot of homelessness for a variety of reasons. One is the weather. I mean, it's far easier to live in California, especially towards the coast during the winter months. So the survivability is far higher. But I don't think you can really put a statistic on this, but I think it's really just people ignoring the problem. I mean, we walk by these people every day, and that's something my parents instilled in me from a young age, and involvement with our church growing up was we did some volunteer work for homeless people in Santa Barbara. There was a program called Transition House, which was transitioning people off the streets into longer term housing and jobs, and we would cook meals for them. So I've always had a soft spot in my heart for homeless people, which many of my crews have teased me about in the fire department of giving stuff to the homeless or providing for them. But I've always, even where I live now, it's I think they're not seen as human, so they're ignored largely, and I think that's one of the biggest problems. And it's easy to harden your heart with that, especially working in the fire department when you're maybe working in an area where you're responding to homeless people quite a bit. And I would imagine that's the same in San Francisco. It's just this prevalent problem that nobody has a great solution for, but taking the humanity out of it can really treat homeless people like a statistic or a number instead of another human being that's in a really tough place.
See, I've heard people talk about homelessness, and apparently it's very easy to solve. If you just get a job and make good decisions, you won't be homeless anymore. This is some of the shit that people talk about, and it blows my fucking mind. And that compassion fatigue, I was the same. Like, if I could put my hand on my heart and say, what did I do right throughout my career? I never let go of that. And if I felt like I was getting burned out, I would take sick days and take mental health days and reset so that I wasn't a dick when I was in uniform again. But it's true. Like, if the moment that you pigeonhole people, and I've talked about this all the time, I hate the word bum, whore, hooker, crackhead, junkie, because now you've labeled some, you dehumanize. That's what you do with an enemy in war. Sure. You dehumanize the Nazis, the Japs, whatever. But the moment you do that, then you give yourself permission not to care about that problem anymore. And it is such a chicken shit way of being a member of the United States. Instead of looking around going, this is not right. We've got human beings, we've got animals, we've got children who are not going to have a roof over their head or food in their stomach tonight. And we are the most affluent country on the planet. What a disgrace. You know what I mean? So I couldn't agree more. The more, and this is happening, I would argue, more so in this latest administration than ever. Not saying that I'm a fan of the previous one, because I can't stand politicians. That's a common denominator. But they have made such a deliberate attempt to dehumanize and pigeonhole entire groups, entire nations. You know what I mean? So the way that we solve humanity and the way that we solve the homelessness crisis are the very tenets that these holy books, whatever you subscribe to, have told us for millennia's worth of wisdom: kindness, compassion,
Yeah.
selflessness, service. You know what I mean? Love thy neighbor. I think that's in one of the books, if I'm not mistaken. So, not to go off on a rant there, but I couldn't agree more. Like, it is unacceptable, and other countries have solved this problem. If I'm not mistaken, there's no homelessness in Japan. You know, I think the Scandinavian countries have very, very little, if any at all, because they look at these people that are struggling with their mental health, with addiction, whatever the things are, financially, and they wrap themselves around, these people that are struggling, lift them up, get back on their feet, and now they're paying taxes. Now they're functioning members of society again, or they're being taken care of because they can't do that anymore. But you don't see those programs on a national scale. You see beautiful organizations from churches and local community groups, but it's never, 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 never a national conversation, other than homeless are the scourge of our city and we need to drive them away somewhere else because we've got an Olympics coming.
Oh, well said, James. I mean, I used to work with a guy that said, I support the homeless by not being one of them. Similar to like it was a choice. And we can get into it later, but I think especially through counseling and working with some people that were addicts and homeless, and you hear their story, and I mean, I don't understand how you couldn't be sympathetic to what they went through to end up living on the street. And then the whole, did trauma cause the homelessness or did homelessness cause the trauma? And I mean, that's all mixed up together too, listening to their story. It's not a black and white thing.
No. And I think this is what's so exciting about these conversations in 2026. And we're standing on the shoulders of the real pioneers in, mental health and cancer and all these things that we suffer from in our profession specifically. But now we know what these things are. We know each of these little slivers of someone's story that took them to addiction, to, to homelessness, to whatever the thing is. And now you can start unpacking it. So then, which came first, the trauma from childhood, trauma on the streets. Was like, well, we can address both. So how about we do that? How about we get this person off the street and then we help them start processing their trauma? And then now we empower them with some social programs to get them a job, get them, as you said, a roof over their head. And now they go through their post-traumatic growth and they start helping people that are struggling. I had a guy on, Rob Banghart, who was one of the many, many homeless addicts that lived in the tunnels under Las Vegas.
Oh, wow.
And that was his world. And now he's a mentor for all these people that are struggling with their homelessness, struggling with their addiction. And he's a beacon of light now. So this is the thing, if we can help, is teach a man to fish, drive them away. Okay, you gave them a fish, you opened a shelter and fed them for a night, but you get them back on their feet. Now they become, a force multiplier to help this issue in the first place.
Glad you brought this up. When I was in grad school, one of the classes I took, we had to do a community project or a research project to pitch a community project. So I went way overboard in how much effort I put into it. But I was interested in homeless response from an EMS standpoint, because that was such a large percentage in certain areas of Orange County of what we responded to. And I knew that was true for other cities. So I interviewed an Orange County sheriff that was assigned to their homeless task force in Orange County, and then a social worker that was part of the homeless outreach program here in Carlsbad through the police department. And then San Diego City Fire had one of the early programs in homeless outreach response where they would partner up a firefighter paramedic with a social worker or a therapist and respond to people. And I learned that there were a lot of resources available to homeless people in both of these counties, and how I think it was much needed, because as you know from where you've worked, like you respond to a homeless person, and it's not just a chief complaint in an emergency treatment. Like there's a whole gamut of issues from nutrition, shelter, prescription medications, long-term illnesses. So I think some of these departments that have addressed that problem and get them more into a system where they can offer more resources is far more effective, with the goal of lowering the percentage of EMS calls that are spent on the homeless population that maybe aren't emergent calls, or, as we know, running on the same patient over and over because they're not getting the support or the help they need.
This is where I don't see any conversation at all, is the proactive side. And what you're talking about on a micro level, because obviously these units can only respond to one individual at a time, is trying to, get ahead of it, as it were, before they start declining and become an emergency. Because, I had this comment, especially, some of my LA firefighters and, again, San Francisco and Oakland, saying, well, yeah, but, it's homelessness that's driving a lot of our calls. And it's the same with the violence on our streets, the gang shootings and the addiction and some of the other things, the overdoses. Is where is the conversation of, okay, well, what's the root cause of so many of these? And we know that addiction is a massive driver of homelessness. We know that the sale of illicit drugs is a massive contributor to the reason that we have gangs, and most places don't. There's not gang warfares on the streets of Lisbon. There aren't. And so where's the conversation about, well, what if we remove the prohibition of addiction? Now, it doesn't mean that you can sell drugs, doesn't mean you can smuggle drugs, but like Portugal did, if you run on me and, you're a police officer and I have 7 days worth of, whatever the drug is, I'm not arrested. I'm not even forced to go into addiction programming. I'm educated on the resources that are available to me. There's no stigma. There's no threat of a criminal record because you haven't detained me. You're not charging me with anything. You're looking at me and going, well, this is a guy who's struggling with a mental health issue. We're going to educate them on the tools in the medical community that are available to them. So these Portuguese, men and women now come out the shadows because they're not scared of being arrested for their struggles. There's addiction counseling, there's mental health counseling, there's job creation, there's housing, and they completely reversed their opioid crisis in about 8 years. And I had the guy in Portugal that spearheaded that on the show a couple of times.
Yeah.
So that is a proactive issue. Now their courts are freed up to start, prosecuting the really bad people out there. Their law enforcement agencies are freed up to pursue the smugglers, the dealers. They got a lot of people trying to get through from Brazil and some of the other areas. And so they've revolutionized it. In Norway, the way that they do prisons, lowest recidivism on the planet, and their prisons look like housing communities. They don't have their freedom, but their prisoners live together, cook, clean, go to school, go to work, so that when they get out, they are groomed to be a functioning member of society again. They weren't locked in a box having to sharpen up a toothbrush in case they were going to get murdered that night. So there are so many programs out there that other countries are doing really well, but you don't hear us talking about them because we are, let's beat our chest now, the greatest country in the world. But we're not. We're an amazing country full of amazing people, but there are other countries doing some areas better than us. And if we want to elevate ourselves and everyone else, then we say, okay, Portugal, tell me about your drug policy. Norway, tell me about prisons. Finland, tell me about schools. Japan, tell me about portion control. And all of a sudden now the rising tide lifts all ships. But we're not going to solve any of these until we collectively as a nation care enough to tell our governments, we need to do something else. This isn't working.
Totally agree. And I know you've written about this in your first book, One More Light, and how important that is. And that's what I love about your work is you just don't look at the surface level problem. You're looking at, what's the root of this problem? What's underneath it? And I think that's so important when we're talking about it: addiction, homelessness, injury, health in the United States, health in the fire department. It's like, what's underneath that? What's feeding these issues? Because we can keep just trying to chip away at the surface level, and that's just medicating or putting Band-Aids on the symptoms and not going to the source.
Absolutely. Well, I feel I've been doing more talking than you, so let's get the spotlight back on you. Talk to me about your transition from EMT in San Francisco to fire in Southern California.
Well, there's a woman involved with that.
This is one in my journey too.
So my wife now, her and I met in college. I'm 2 years older. So I was a graduating senior, and she was going off to study abroad at University of Bristol. So we met at a very inopportune time and spent a few close months together. And then I graduated, moved up to San Francisco, and then she went off to England to study abroad. She came back after about 6 months because she got pretty sick over there, and socialized medicine at the time was not kind to Americans. So came back, and then I learned, as I started to gravitate towards the fire service, I found out about a firefighter paramedic academy at Palomar, North County, San Diego. So she came back to San Diego to finish school. I came back down to start this program, and of course to be with her. And went through the fire academy first, had a month off, proposed to my girlfriend, now wife, and then started paramedic school, tested with the JPA, which is the Joint Power Authority in North County, San Diego. I think it's a conglomerate of 10 departments. It was back then. I don't know what it is now. So it was cool. You could test for 10 different departments all at once. And going through the Palomar Academy, that firefighters from the local departments were instructors, and they were all watching us to see who they maybe wanted to recruit. So I was lucky enough to go to the city of Escondido and started with their fire department 2 weeks after I finished my paramedic internship.
Couple questions. Firstly, what was your wife studying at University of Bristol? Because that was one city over from where I grew up.
Oh, really? So I was pre-med and she was political science. I was going to become a doctor and she was going to become a lawyer, and we both took totally different tracks. She became a high school teacher and is a tremendous presence for high school kids now.
What about the socialized medicine? I mean, the NHS to me is, in my opinion, the philosophy is the best on the planet, that everyone else takes care of the people that need the help at that moment. And then if it's done properly, that you forge the healthiest nation that you can. So you use the least amount of money when you're doing it. That being said, I know that, that there are a lot of people that go from other countries that are taken care of and no one asks any questions. But what was the stumbling block that she saw?
Stumbling block she saw, she got pretty sick and couldn't get medicine for it. And that might have been through the student health at the school. I don't know for sure. And that was 25 years ago as well. And maybe it's because she wasn't a citizen, maybe because it was a student. I don't know for sure, but needed antibiotics, did not get them. And I think she was pretty sick with pneumonia by the time she got back to the U.S. Maybe she just
that's a shame.
Missed me.
Well, you were she's meant to come back regardless. But yeah, because I've heard people that have literally been to the UK visiting, had some issue happen, went to hospital, were kind of bracing themselves for this massive bill. And they were like, no, you're good. This is what we do in this country. And off they went. And this was after procedures. Cool. So it might have been that she was unlucky with the communication of, getting the help that she needed.
Yeah. And I mean, to go back to what you were talking about before, in looking at how other countries do it, and this kind of superiority attitude we can have in the U.S., it's like our way of doing things is the best, is very, very blinding to outside influences. And it's like, well, maybe there is a country that's doing this far better than we are. Let's look at what they're doing, or we don't need to reinvent the wheel. And I think on a smaller level, we see that with fire departments too. You know, 100 years of tradition not impeded by progress. And I was fortunate to work for a department that was a little more progressive, and even training wise looked at, okay, what's this other department doing? Or we have this idea, maybe somebody's already researched and tried it out before. And I think having that open attitude takes both a country and a state and a city and a fire department much further than it's our way or the highway.
I think another important factor, and this is just, it is what it is you can't find the best ways of doing it if your first question is, how can I make a lot of money doing this? There are solutions out there that aren't about profit. And that, I know that blows people's minds in this country, because the goal is to have all the money in the world. But when you look at Portugal, Finland, all these other places, it's not focused on, building a business. It's focused on what's the best for the nation, best for the community. And don't get me wrong, it can be fiscally efficient, or you can make a business, you can make a living doing it. But I think this worshipping of the pursuit of the monopoly has actually crippled us in many, many areas. And we're seeing, even with this whole data center conversation now, like people are finally opening their eyes, like, wait a second, this thing that we really could live without just fine is now going to absorb all our most valuable resources. Yeah, this is what these businesses have been doing for millennia. Look at Purdue Pharma with OxyContin. They don't give a shit about how many Americans die. They just care about their profit. That is it. 100,000 Americans every year. And we just shrug our shoulders. Maybe, just maybe, the pursuit of wealth is not the best way of running a country.
I agree. And as we get more into psychedelic medicine and how that starts to filter in with Western culture, we can already see big pharma trying to monetarize it.
Absolutely. All right. Well, then let's move forward in your fire service career. Firstly, you mentioned the city. Were you absorbed by OCFA, or did you move to that agency?
I moved to OCFA. Escondido was a great place to work. I was a brand new firefighter, brand new paramedic. Met some really good people there, ran a ton of calls, which I needed. Spent time on the engine, the ambulance, then came over on the truck. Just a quick funny story is the truck captain was on to me. He nicknamed me Andy, and he called me Andy from Andy Dufresne in the Shawshank Redemption, in that I was slowly chipping my way out of Escondido. And so those of you that remember the story, Andy puts the poster up in his cell, and it changes every couple months. The original short story is called Rita Hayworth in the Shawshank Redemption, because he had a poster of Rita Hayworth. So yeah, I was tunneling my way out because I was looking for more opportunity. I wanted to do USAR and hazmat, and City of San Diego was the only department to really do that in San Diego County. So applied to Orange County and moved up there just purely from an opportunity standpoint, and wanting more to do than a smaller city department.
You mentioned in the kind of bio that you sent prior, the Hotel California story. Was that within OCFA, or was that prior?
That was at OCFA. So our hazmat station at the time was located next to UC Irvine, and it was on California Avenue. And the joke with the hazmat program was like, once you're hazmat certified, they always pulled you back. And I was interested in hazmat, so became a hazmat technician, then a specialist as a firefighter paramedic. Left, went to another station, promoted to engineer. They sucked me back in to the hazmat station because I had the cert. Left again to testing, promoted to captain, probationary captain year, put me right back at hazmat station. So since it was on California, they called it the Hotel California because you could check into the hazmat program anytime you wanted, but you could never leave. And the hazmat station is now at Station 20 in Irvine, and I think they've renamed the university station. It's just no longer the Hotel California. Now I'm just dating myself.
I remember testing. I think it was Anaheim Station 8 that we butted up with you guys there. So I did run a lot of calls with the county on some of those, surrounding areas.
The original one was just a 3-person engine and this, we called it the fire trailer. And the firefighter I worked with when I was an engineer, Linda, and then my captain, Rich, were all into CrossFit. So it was the CrossFit fire trailer. And man, both of them were super fit. But we ate well, we did a lot of exercise, ran a lot of phone calls together. So that was a fun time during my career.
What year was it that you were doing CrossFit? Because I was introduced to it by an Anaheim guy who trained at, I think it was CrossFit Harbor, I think that's what it was called, or Marina, CrossFit Marina, I think it was. It was Huntington Beach, and it was one of the very first affiliates, if I'm not mistaken. So that was about 2006. I was introduced to it, which, was a long time ago now, 20 years, but it blew me away. I was so impressed. And it's only that our programming in my gym where I train now shifted away from the main CrossFit philosophy to a kind of offshoot, which I like even more now. But I found the application in the fire service so good back then. So what year were you introduced, and talk to me about your experience of it?
So about the same time, James. It's interesting how similar our careers line up. It was probably in 2006 because I got hired by OCFA in 2004, probably made my way to the hazmat station in 2006, sometime around there. One of the guys in my academy who was an absolute stud, former Navy SEAL, became our academy leader. He turned 40 in the academy and ran circles with us. Through some of his SEAL team buddies, they were introduced to CrossFit. So he actually brought CrossFit to our organization, and we hosted 2 seminars at our headquarters with Greg Glassman, and the original Nasty Girls were all instructors. So we were all working at Station 4 together. So we had the benefit of going to the UCI gym, and we would do a CrossFit workout together in the morning because it was engine, truck, medic, battalion chief. So it was a big station. And then we'd play basketball afterwards. So we were burning, thousands of calories a day. And I really enjoyed it. I mean, when I first started doing CrossFit, I think I could do 3 pull-ups. Like I just always sucked at pull-ups. And just that constant repetition and building and building and building, then, I mean, the next thing I know, I'm doing workouts with 50 or 100 pull-ups in them and just never thought I'd get to that level. And I liked the CrossFit philosophy back then because it was geared towards athletes and military and firefighters and cops who were already working out, but it was taking them to a higher level. Their whole motto of forging elite fitness. And I like that of taking somebody that has a sport or a job and taking them to a much higher training level. So it was a very cool experience.
See, again, similar experience. When I was at University of North London, before I traveled and ultimately ended up in America, I could do 1 pull-up. I shit you not. And I'm not even like a big guy, so with a low body weight. And it's weird because I'm a farm boy originally, but pull-ups for some reason I didn't have them. Fast forward a couple of years into CrossFit, 2 or 3 years, and now I'm doing legless rope climbs. which again is even harder than a pull-up. So I just remember looking back, and I was older then, and going, wow, this is great. I know this works because, you can see the progress. If you're going up one pin in a pec deck, you're not really feeling you're progressing. But when you hoist your own body up a rope that you could never even climb with your legs before, that's, I think, those kind of micro wins that you got in CrossFit was phenomenal. And then, as you said, the less is more mentality of the original programming before the games got involved and people were doing, like 2-a-days and 2-hour workouts. I think that minimally effective dose was better. Like, I think I was a better athlete back then. I became better when I got good coaching later on. But I feel like for a while it got corrupted by the games. I think it's found its way back to a better place now.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because when it started to move towards marketing to everyone, that's where it kind of lost me, of taking someone that was maybe pretty out of shape and unconditioned, and then doing complex Olympic movements with heavy weights, had some detrimental effects on people. And it just got bigger, like a lot of things do, and it became more marketed towards the masses.
The one we do now was founded by a guy called Greg Wolf, who was a CrossFit guy himself and kind of splintered off. And the programming is called Wolf Brigade, but it's still, the basic lifts, but they leaned a lot more into the kettlebells as far as heavy, and it's just a Russian swing, never over your head. But, we're swinging like 150-pound bells,
Oh, wow.
and then mace work and, unilateral movements, a lot of slam balls. And then the cardio component will be on an Airdyne or something. So very short, but just awful. You fall off and want to puke. But it's still, it's an absolute tribute to where CrossFit came from. But I feel like it's the next evolution of. And there's people that love CrossFit and stay with CrossFit and they still thrive. But for me, the more competitive it got, it was never about competing for me. It was about being a good firefighter. And I feel like this programming now, not only are we back to where I wanted to be, but also the injuries are almost zero in the gym now. And not that CrossFit was dangerous as a program, but exactly like you said, if you didn't have the stability and the mobility and the incremental loading that's required to be a good athlete in the CrossFit space, and you cut corners, that's where we were seeing, the back injuries and the shoulders and things like that.
Yeah, this took place at a time, I think right before I started for Orange County, that the wellness and fitness programs was well funded, because I think the higher ups finally saw that there was a lot of preventative maintenance investing in wellness and fitness, because then the injuries would go down. So fitness was being stressed, and that just grew as I grew up in Orange County's system, is this focus towards fitness and how important it was for injury prevention. And I think that was a really, really good model. And I just saw a post today. Our next Fire Academy started today, and it's a wellness and fitness post of stressing what they're doing with those guys and gals from the very beginning.
How competitive was it to get hired back when you first started? And then if you're hearing at all, what is that level of interest in the fire service now locally?
Good question. So I think when I took the written test, 6,000 of us took the test, and then that was whittled down. Then we had to take a physical agility test that was through Rio Hondo College. That wasn't super difficult compared to the one that I did at Palomar. Palomar was more of the combat challenge that was pretty intense. So I knew I'd, training through that in my first academy, and seeing that this other one, even though I hadn't taken it, the events were quite a bit easier. So I was able to cruise through that. So to make a long story short, from 6,000, it was whittled down to 2 academies. So 60, 2 academies of 30. So 6,000 to 60. And I just told myself, if I can just make it to an interview, I think my communication skills are good enough and my background and my experience to sell myself. And I was fortunate. I made it into that academy. We were the first ones to go through our new tower at the time. Now it's 24 years later.
And that was 6,000 certified people, not civilians.
Right. Yeah, that had the minimum qualifications, which were probably EMT and high school level. But I look at that too, and 2/3 of my academy had college degrees, which wasn't required.
And what are you hearing now? Are those numbers the same?
Those numbers are definitely not the same. And I think working conditions are different. There's a lot more demands put on firefighters, and the benefits aren't as good. I mean, when I started in Orange County, I wasn't paying anything into retirement. And that was always a big draw for people in the fire department was the retirement. And by the end, when I did retire, I think 18% of my paycheck was going into retirement. So that's a huge, huge amount. And it's back then it was 3% at 50. Now I think it's 2.7 at 57, I want to say. I mean, I know we'll get into my own interests, but I can't imagine working that late with how physical a toll the fire service takes on you. So you're right, James. Yeah. It's definitely going down, and the fire service does not have the same draw that it used to.
Well, this is why it's important that people hear this. Like you testing for OC Orange County Fire Authority. I just messed up the acronym then. I was testing for Anaheim, and in my test of 1,000 people at the written, everyone had fire, EMT, or paramedic, and then at least everyone that was hired had another resume. Like my truck partner, one of my best friends, was a lifeguard in South Africa, and then in Newport Beach. You know what I mean? So there were people that were, Forest Service, ambulance operators, explorers. I mean, this just resume, because it was so competitive. So when I talk about the work week, and I won't take a dive in because we got a lot to talk about with this, and I'm talking about the recruitment and retention crisis, we have complete amnesia as a profession that it was only up till about 10 years ago that thousands and thousands and thousands of men and women were fighting for one position as a firefighter, to the point where I had many friends in that class that had been trying for 2 or 3 years before they got picked up. So we have the ability to figure out what's broken, fix it. And therefore we will go back to those numbers again. We really will, because it wasn't even 9/11. You ask the guys in the 90s, it was super, super competitive. It's been like this for a long, long time. And so we've completely destroyed this because of all the things. And you've just mentioned some more, in Florida, while I was at Orange County, Florida, I actually made less after 5 years because they cut the pensions here too. So we had to start paying, 3%, I think was the bump that we had initially. But yeah, and I didn't have a pay raise. So I made less after 5 years than when I got hired. I just put myself through medic school. So I got that bump, but that was unsupported by them. So this is the point, is that you can't ask people to do less with more. You can't keep cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting and expect these people to show up just because of the service burning in their heart. It's an absolute spit in the face for anyone that toes the line. So when we pull these out into the spotlight, we can say, these are the things that you fucked up the last 20 years. Change them, and you will have people start coming again. Ignore them, and you're going to have to tell your constituency why they don't have a fire department anymore.
Yeah, and it changes the whole attitude. I mean, when we started and how competitive it was, I mean, our commitment to our jobs, I think, higher. And now when it's a smaller group of elite people, you may get more people in that are just trying out, and they go, this isn't for me, or they're not super committed because they didn't have to compete as much to get to the job. So I think there's an attitude shift too that you didn't see 10 or 20 years ago.
Absolutely. Like every test I took in Anaheim, I had to take a 2,500 plane ride to test from Florida to each of those levels, the written, the physical. You know what I mean? So that's the level of commitment that we needed.
Yeah.
I would work a full-time job, exercise during the lunch hour, get to the academy early, do extra PT, because you had to stand out. You practice, interviews, all the things. And that's what is expected of a profession where lives are at stake. You can't just take 80% of the list and cross your fingers that it works out. That's not how it works. I want to kind of steer you onto, this mental health side that we're going to talk about. So as you progress through, where do you start seeing some of the struggles yourself? And then, what was the darkest place that you found yourself?
Good question. So like many firefighters, I didn't think any of it bothered me. And I was into it. I was interested in it. I loved human anatomy. I loved emergency medicine. I loved firefighting and training and all the stuff we did. And somewhere along the line, I switched that emotional switch off. And a lot of the clients I work with now, especially in military, police, and fire, I talk about that switch. Is like we were trained to turn that emotional switch off because we were going in, we were mission focused, we were going in where people were running out, like we always say. And our body and our mind are sending us all these alarm signals like, don't do that, it's dangerous. And we trained to shut it off because we had to in order to function in those jobs. And it was totally necessary. With that, we learned to switch off the emotional switch, which was also necessary. Like I can't come in and command an incident and be a total emotional wreck, or I can't run a code and be like, oh my gosh, what happened to this person? And I'm weeping with the family. It would just be a mess. So we learned to turn that off. But switching that switch back on isn't a simple switch. It's like once it's turned off, it's hard to access again. So to answer your question, about the 13-year mark in my career, I started to take a hard look at how much I was drinking and realized I had a problem. So I started seeing a therapist, and through seeing a therapist, I started to unpack all this shit and realized, whoa, I've been carrying a lot in the proverbial backpack that we always talk about in mental health. I've just been stacking it in there and just ignored it. And my ego and testosterone and everything just told me I didn't have a problem until it was overflowing, like many of us. And was sober for about 6 months, working with a therapist, but I was a dry drunk. I was pissed that I had a problem with drinking. I was pissed that I couldn't drink, and I was pissed at myself that I had this problem. And I was just white knuckling it. Luckily, I was working with a therapist and unpacking a lot of this stuff. So that's where I started to unravel. The darkest moment, and I haven't shared this with a lot of people, but I think it's important. It's an important part of my story because it's mixed with alcohol. I was at a peer support conference as a peer supporter being trained, went to a very difficult class where 3 women presented about losing their firefighter husbands to suicide three different stories. One of them was the wife of Eric Weave, who was an Orange County firefighter who jumped off a bridge at a very busy freeway overpass. And I'm close to some of the people that were close to Eric, and just the impact that took. One of the women presenting talked about Eric and losing him. I was trying to stop drinking, but not really committed. So I separated myself from the group that night, went out to dinner by myself, started drinking, was trying to find a hotel bar that was away from our hotel so nobody would see me. And that night, the demons started asking me what it'd feel like to jump off a building. And I wasn't drunk, but I was not sober. And just to think how dark a place alcohol drove me, that I would consider jumping off a building just for the feeling, was pretty alarming. And luckily I didn't go to the top or anything, but I shared with someone that I worked with in peer support that had no idea. And it just shows you how easy it is to isolate ourselves, and with the influence of a substance can drive a firefighter like myself to even consider suicide. And that was one night.
Over and over again, I've heard people, whether it's Elizabeth Pohl, who's done a load of kind of like psychological autopsies on law enforcement suicides, and then other people in the psychology, psychiatry space. But alcohol is nearly always present in these suicide attempts. And this is a tongue-in-cheek example, tongue-in-cheek. But when you think about when you were a young man, and maybe that you spent time romantically with a young woman, and the next morning you woke up and like, oh, I probably wouldn't have chosen this young woman had I not been drinking. We know that it distorts our judgment, and it does. It softens it. How many people have got into a street fight that never would have if they were stone cold sober? The other thing that I hear over and over again, I'm curious to get this, your perspective on this, because this may not be a factor the way you described it, but we were raised, our generation was raised that suicide was selfish and cowardly, and how could they? And ironically, I shared a tragic video of a female Denver firefighter who took her own life 2 years ago. Yeah. Well, if you look at the comments, it started off, really, really warm and compassionate. And then the nastiness starts to get in, and it's a sin, and you're going to hell, and women shouldn't be in the fire, all this shit. So for anyone, if you're listening, then you were not, because you don't want to be a better person. That's the kind of shit that sends people to that point. That's the organizational betrayal that, is a compounding factor. But that shame, guilt, think of the kids, think of the wife. After listening to almost 300 people now, of which so many have had testimonies of their own dark places, there's another element that you don't hear mentioned in a lot of the spaces, which is this. When these people reach this perfect storm because of all these contributing factors combined, not one single thing, but all the things, childhood trauma, sleep deprivation, organizational betrayal, the things that we see on the calls, side effects of psych meds, alcohol, et cetera, TBIs. And now they get to this point, their reality is so distorted. Their actual reality, their perception of real life is so distorted that they believe that they are a burden to the very people that they love. And that so many times I hear people say they believe that if I just take my own life, and I'm in a profession where I would die for a stranger, I'm certainly going to do this for someone that I adore, that would solve the problem, that they would be happier. Makes no sense to a healthy brain, but we're not talking about a healthy brain. Did you have any whispers yourself of this feeling of burdensome as you were starting to get this kind of ideation permeating your mind?
I didn't at that time, but it's come up again. And I think that the extremely negative self-talk, that self-judgment, like I can see how that pathway can go. And I agree with you. In the people I've worked with that have been close to suicide, is they are thinking about their families, but they're thinking I would be better off if I wasn't around anymore, because their self-image is so low. And thank God I wasn't at that point at, that night. And wasn't the perfect storm. It was, a lot of it was alcohol related, but I get that. I've been in similar places since then. And man, it just breaks my heart. And those people are so alone and so isolated that they think that that the world would be better off without them, and how untrue that is. And even when they hear it from those brothers or sisters around them, like, they still can't believe it, because like you said, their mindset is so distorted.
Well, I think it's an important perspective for two reasons. Firstly, as a warning, it's a red flag if you hear that voice in your own mind, if you still have the ability to recognize it, or if you're around the firehouse or the family dinner table and you start hearing, I'm a piece of shit, it's all my fault, like, that is a red flag.
Yeah.
It's not someone being salty, air quotes. Discard that term. It doesn't mean anything. Salty is someone who's struggling, so there's that. But then also, if you have lost someone to suicide, the widows that you were talking about, I think when you understand that that person was probably terrified, but also had to find the courage to take themselves out because they thought that was the problem, and they went through with their suicide, it wasn't because they didn't love you. It wasn't because they were a coward and they were running from the pain. Based on every single person that I have spoken to that was right there, or some even went through with their attempts and they spoke to me because they survived their attempt, it was that they thought they were doing it for their family. So it made that courageous and selfless, even though it makes no sense to us at that moment. And I hope that gives, that reframes the suicides in some of these loved ones' minds, that it wasn't just to get away from them, quite the opposite, and give them some grace and realize that they weren't in the same thinking space that you and I are today.
Yeah. And I've lost a cousin to suicide when he was in his early 20s, and alcohol and THC were both factors. And his parents, my aunt and uncle, are some of the most wonderful people I've met in this world. So it was just so unexpected, as it is, but just to think of where their mindset was, and then have that magnified or amplified by a substance, is like you're saying, that unfortunately a common occurrence.
You mentioned the head of your academy was a Navy SEAL. Was that Nate Brown?
No, that was a friend of mine named Tony. He lives in Carlsbad still. But Tony, I think, was the tip of the spear in staffing almost an entire SEAL team in our department of guys that he had worked with, or it's a small community, as we know, but guys looking to get out of the Navy and do something that I think was still somewhat adventurous, but didn't take them away for 6 months to a year. So we've had a number of SEALs come to our department since then. And Nate Brown, who you spoke of, is one of those guys that I had the fortune of working with at my last station, Station 59 in San Clemente. Nate was on another shift, but we often worked together.
So you mentioned about working with a counselor, trying to focus on your sobriety. How did your mental health search for, the tools in the toolbox take you to the psychedelic space and ultimately meet Nate in that capacity?
So that was towards the end of 2019, that I'd been working with a therapist, kind of gone up and down with my sobriety. So towards the end of 2019, I just got to the point where I cannot drink. I had tried going back to it socially, would have one or two drinks, which would last, I could do that one sitting, but then that led within a week to escalating drinking behavior. So at the end of 2019, I made the decision I got to stop drinking altogether. Like I can't do it in moderation. It's a mess. So I stopped New Year's Eve of 2019, right before 2020. And that's because I had to work a shift on New Year's Day. So I'm like, well, I'm not going to do it last hurrah. I got to work the next day. Plus, I want to be done. So I met Nate Brown, who's a former SEAL and got hired as a firefighter in Orange County, went to paramedic school through our department, became a paramedic as well. A great guy, dear friend to this day. And he's funny. He was watching the three captains at the station because we didn't all get along very well and we were always at odds. So he started planting little seeds about plant medicine with me. So that first month that I started my permanent sobriety, I went in the medicine space with Nate and a shamanic facilitator I was working with. And I didn't do it for alcohol. I actually went into the medicine space for porn addiction. I had struggled with porn, which ended up being a far tougher addiction to overcome than alcohol. And just a side note with that is I think pornography is the silent epidemic of men and women right now. I think because of the shame and also kind of the acceptance by our Western culture of how porn shows up in entertainment, music, movies, like it's far more acceptable. But that's a separate conversation. So I went in the medicine space because nothing else had worked. And so that January of 2020, I just went for one night with a small group, and it was a very safe group. It was all veterans and firefighters. Some were both. Some had been SEALs that had become firefighters as well. And that night, it was MDMA, which is a big heart opener. We call it a heart medicine. And as a paramedic, like I think heart medicine, like it has cardiac effects. And I had to kind of unlearn that. And heart medicine means it opening up of the heart. And it's been very effective for military, police, and fire because we're all armored up. Like I said, that switch is turned off. That emotional switch is turned off. We're turned off from the alarms in our body. MDMA is a way of setting that armor down or taking the turnouts and the helmet off and opening up your heart. And then that same night, they use psilocybin, which is more of a spirit medicine, and it comes in and does some of that work. So I covered a lot that night, and it was interesting that a big piece that came up was suicides that I had run on as a paramedic of, teenagers or young kids hanging from trees or hanging from a stairway banister and their parents discovering them and declaring this patient dead while the family is just absolutely losing it. Like I had never acknowledged how much of an impact that had on me. And I learned later that we talk about vicarious trauma, but a lot of the trauma we experience in the fire department isn't vicarious trauma, it's primary trauma. Like we're in it there with the family, with someone that's dead in front of us. It's not something we're hearing about, like we're living in it. So I think that's an important distinction to make, is that it's not vicarious trauma, it's primary trauma that we're exposed to. So that came up that night of all the suicides I'd run on. And I saw this basement of burned up bodies. And it was just like all the shit I'd run on. And kind of the message was, you don't have to carry that anymore. Like you've been carrying this, all the death and destruction you've seen. Like it's not yours to carry, Kelly. You can just be done with it. So leaving that was a big discovery for me. And I just did one night. And from that night, I realized something I was really missing was connection. And that was driving my porn addiction, and not sexual connection with other brothers, with friends who were available, and connection with the group. And that's when I finally sought out a group to start talking about my porn addiction with other men that we could relate to each other, have similar stories, and talk about one of the most shameful aspects of our lives. And that was life changing. That started me on the road to recovery.
I remember, excuse me. I remember, I can't remember where it was now, but I think it may be someone else's podcast, but I heard someone say, actually, I think it was in a conference, that one of the reasons why I think they were pointing more towards infidelity in our professions again was when a man, climaxes, when they, ejaculate, that down regulates the nervous system. And that is why, if you think about porn, whether you're in a loving relationship, your partner isn't always ready to do that at the drop of a hat. But, the accessibility that we have on the phones now versus when we were young and it was a magazine where the papers were stuck together, very, very different medium back then. You can access anything now. So when you started unpacking, with these other men, and obviously the origin might be something different. Was that the thing? Was the release ultimately this down regulation through, the sexual release through porn?
I think that's part of it. And there's a biochemical effect with dopamine. And we talk a lot about dopamine being the pleasure chemical or the pleasure compound. But I like Anna Lemke's description of it more of it is the molecule of more. It's what drives our motivation. But I think separate from that is, I think a lot of us, especially men, seek validation through women. And so then here's this fantasy world that we can control and feel like we're artificially validated by porn. And of course, you and I talking about it here, like that doesn't make any sense cognitively. But I think men see that acceptance from women or that validation from women is very important, driven by this dopamine molecule of wanting more and more and more and building up tolerance with it. And then throw in a control factor piece is like, my life is out of control, or I go on these, out of control calls, and here's this fantasy world that I can have this semblance of control, if that makes sense.
With a lot of addictions, opioids are a good example, or alcohol. You start off with one glass as a young man, and you're off your pickle, as it were. And then now you're binge drinking, and, a 12-pack doesn't make a dent anymore. There is a numbing of the senses, if you like. This is, again, I want to get your perception. This is what it seems to me is behind some of the more destructive elements of porn. You can have porn where two people, let's say it's this whole OnlyFans now, where this couple is actually a couple, and all they've done really is introduce a camera to it, and they're making consensual, loving love to each other, and that's it. But we know that there's so many other darker places that porn goes into, from a real kind of rapey element to, numerous people to, sodomy and all the other things. And it gets worse and worse and worse. And if you're in a good place mentally, you ask yourself, well, why does that even exist? But I would argue that it's the same thing as the tolerance to opioids, a tolerance to alcohol. The danger of porn is that downward spiral of it's never enough. And now you find yourself in a really, really dangerous predatory place.
I agree. I mean, I've heard someone say porn will take you further and darker than you ever thought you'd go. And something I was going to bring up is the 3 A's of porn. Is it's available, like it's super easy to get, it's affordable, most of it's free, and it's anonymous, which makes it such a easy drug. I mean, imagine the laptops that we were on, like you could turn it on and a tray comes out and there's a whiskey shot, or a tray comes out and there's a gram of cocaine or whatever your drug is. Like, I can get that from home and nobody has to know about it. And I don't have to pay for it. I mean, no wonder it's so powerful. And I think the other side that you're talking about, James, is looking at it from the industry side. There's an organization called Fight the New Drug, and I've listened to some of their podcasts, is how wrapped up sex trafficking is in the porn industry, of taking women and then pushing their tolerance further and further of what they ever thought they would do, and it pushes them. So there's a whole dark side wrapped up into that as well.
Absolutely. Well, what has been the healing journey for you then, the post-traumatic growth? You battled, alcoholism, you had this porn addiction. Talk to me about the journey you've been and the healing that you've witnessed in yourself.
So psychedelics and psychedelic therapy is getting talked about a lot now, which I think is a really good thing, because it accelerated my journey, and I think it's true. It consolidates the time of therapy taking place. You can uncover a big trauma or a big piece of your past, have an alternate perspective of it, and heal from it all in the same night, which is incredible. I mean, that could take weeks, months, or years in some other treatment modalities. So I started going maybe 2 times a year. About every 6 months, I would dip back into the medicine space. And it uncovered more and more. It uncovered some of those traumas from childhood that I didn't know about. And it took me to some very dark places, especially revolved around sexuality. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody about that individually, but some of that I keep confidential because it involves some other people that are still alive right now. So I don't want to drag them into this. But it took me to some dark realizations. And there were times where I'm like, man, it'd be easier to have the addiction than deal with this shit that I've now, discovered. And it's interesting in the medicine work. It's like, it's kind of always been at the surface level in the unconscious. And then through psychedelic medicine, it brings the unconscious into the conscious. And then we have to work with it. And that's why the work afterwards is so important. So luckily, I was working with a therapist that was also entering in the medicine space. So he was understanding of it, because I know there are other therapists that think you've joined a cult and you're doing some weird shit, and they're encouraging you to get out of it. But a lot of therapists, you come back to their office and they're like, what have you done? You're a completely different person.
So talk to me about the symptoms that you started getting, and then how you got your Parkinson's diagnosis.
So January of 2022. Our department, like many departments, was having a huge force hire problem. And it seemed like it was only a problem for those of us working on the floor. It didn't seem to be a huge concern for anybody not working on the floor. And I'm biased. I work in operations. I think that's the most important part of the job. That's what most people, when they call 911, expect fire and EMS, not all this other bullshit we've created. So I was teaching hazmat technician, working my regular shifts. So going back to the station on the nights after I taught during the day, and then working my 10 shifts. I think I was forced 4 times that month. So that was 14 shifts I worked that month. Teaching on my days off, started a new class for my master's program. And COVID had a resurgence, so we were having to test the guys before to start a class. And there was this pressure to put this hazmat class on because it had been put on hold because of COVID. So a lot of stressors. So when I would walk, my arm was kind of shifted forward, kind of like Bob Dole holding the pen. And my arms wouldn't swing. And I thought, oh, I'm just stressed out. I got way too much going on. Well, February comes along. I'm done teaching. Forces didn't go away, but I've got more of my life back. Well, then I developed a tremor in my right hand. And then I was having trouble brushing my teeth, and I was having trouble writing. I was having trouble typing. I was having trouble eating. And I remember watching my grandfather, my mom's dad. He had Parkinson's disease. So I picked up on some of the same symptoms, and it wasn't going away. So I went to see my doctor, who referred me to a neurologist. It took me 6 months to get into a neurologist. So thank God I didn't have a brain tumor or something else going on, because I would have been fucked. That would have grown for another 6 months, unbeknownst to any kind of doctor or medical care. Saw her. She did an MRI. That all came back normal. So that was good news. And then she sent me in for what's called a DAT scan, which they attach a radioisotope to a dopamine analog and look at dopamine activity in your brain. And so I read the radiology report before I even met with her, and it was pretty clear that there was some abnormal or low dopamine activity. So I met with her, and I could tell we were meeting virtually like you and I are. I could tell she hadn't read the report yet. And she's like, there's some symptoms of Parkinson's. And then I could see her reading over the report. I was like, yeah, it looks like you have Parkinson's disease. Like, you couldn't read the freaking radiology report before you met with me to deliver me some life-changing news. So that was awesome. So I was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease a year later after having symptoms in January 23.
Someone the other day made a comment about socialized medicine, going back to the UK for a second. They're like, oh, the problem is, I know someone who had to wait 6 months for whatever it was. And I've said, have you never heard that story happen in the US? I hear it all the time.
Oh, yeah.
These people spend a shitload of money on their healthcare, and they still wait in the ER for 12 hours on a gurney before they get to bed. They still wait 6 months for a specialty appointment like this or a surgery. And yes, there are some places where you can go with loads of money and you can get an MRI or whatever done quickly, but there's this complete mythology that we have the system where at a drop of a hat you can get anything done, and that's bullshit. In some areas, maybe if there's not a high frequency of patients and there happens to be a saturation of providers, then yeah, maybe the ratio is more prone to a lesser waiting time. But most of the places, especially in the urban setting, you are going to be waiting a long time, and to your point, had that been something even worse than a Parkinson's diagnosis,
Correct.
Those 6 months could have been imperative to you living and you dying.
Yeah. Pretty disappointing.
So what do you do with that information? You come from a medical background. Obviously, you've been on some of these healing journeys when it comes to your mental health, and then you get that bomb dropped on you. How do you start walking forward from that mentally, and then from a treatment point of view?
So incredibly frustrating, to say the least, especially as we talked about CrossFit. And I had always put fitness as a priority throughout my career in nutrition. And it's like, man, I've done my best to be most fit I can be, the most prepared for the job. And now my body is betraying me. And that's been a very difficult path to walk down. That first year, the neurologist, I agreed to take one medication, and that was an MAOI that prevented the breakdown of dopamine. So the thought was that it would keep dopamine around for longer in my system. So then I heard about cold plunging and how that boosts dopamine and norepinephrine. And I went to a place in Carlsbad called Breathe Degrees that did breathwork classes and then cold plunge at the end, and felt fantastic after the end. So then built my own cold plunge at home out of a chest freezer, and I would do that every morning, and that would keep my dopamine up till about 1 or 2 in the afternoons, and then it would start to come down. So I did that for about a year, and it worked. And then I started losing more control of my right leg, and my foot started to contract, and then my balance started getting a little screwy. And that's when I started seeing a new neurologist at UC San Diego, and he's been awesome. And he talked to me about going on the classic carbidopa, levodopa. And I was hesitant to do that because of the dyskinesia it can cause long term. And he was straightforward with me. He's like, if you start it now or start it later, you're probably going to have that dyskinesia one way or another from taking the medicine. So that's been a battle, James, of finding the right medication and what works. And early on, before I was diagnosed with Parkinson's and was having the tremors, they put me on a beta blocker, metoprolol, and it helped with the tremors. But I was doing a workout at one of the stations on an overtime, and heart rate should have been, in the 140s or so. I look at my heart rate watch, 65. And I'm like, I don't.
Your body's like, I am not getting enough oxygen. You better fix this.
Like, this is probably not a good idea to stay on the beta blocker. And it made me feel screwy. But I've been on the carbidopa, levodopa, and it helps, but I'm functional with it, but it's been tough. But one thing that both neurologists told me was staying fit will help with this disease. And I said, well, I can do that. So I started at a boxing gym because my clinical supervisor at the time, she was getting her PsyD, and her supervisor worked with Parkinson's patients and mentioned boxing. And she first told me that, I thought, oh, that's a terrible idea. That's how I got into this mess, was getting hit in the head. So I'm not about to go boxing. It's like, no, you're boxing a big bag or mitts or a speed bag. So that's two things I never would have done, is voluntarily get in cold water and step foot in a boxing gym. And both of those have been very, very helpful.
I know Muhammad Ali, that was Parkinson's pugilista, I think is what they called his condition. But it's interesting, when we're talking about this, because there's no proof that, oh, this is definitely the thing. But when you look at the correlation between head trauma early on and whether it's Parkinson's or ALS, I had Eric Stevens on a few years ago, LAFD firefighter that has ALS. Rob Burrows, I've got his book in front of me. He was a very, very famous English rugby player that got ALS. Oh. We're seeing a correlation. And I think this, again, is another opportunity for conversation. You can have a great game of football, playing flag football, where you're not destroying the person. And we're talking about the younger people, everything else is the same, the chasing people down, the throws, the interceptions, everything, every other piece. You're just not, as you said, spearing someone helmet to helmet. And I think that, you know, retroactively looking at the downstream cost of some of these sports, it's like, how can we change the way that we do it? Not eliminate sport and contact and everything, but how can we address some of these elements? So maybe, just maybe, someone is less likely to get Parkinson's, ALS, or some of these other neurodegenerative diseases that we're seeing.
I agree. And through this journey, I started doing my own research on chemical exposure and with firefighters and with my time on the hazmat team. And I saw there'd been a fair amount of research that linked chemical exposure to Parkinson's disease. And I hadn't even thought about making a workers' comp claim for it until I realized I wasn't going back. And so filed this claim, and they sent me to a neuropsychologist, then a neurologist, and then a toxicologist, and they all agreed there was a direct link to the fire department and chemical exposure. And I have been fortunate to be put in contact with guys from other departments who are about my same age, you know, relatively young, that have been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And we're seeing a big prevalence of neurodegenerative diseases with firefighters, like you said, ALS and Parkinson's. And I recently worked on a committee with a guy named Jeff Hughes from Orange County that's done a ton of cancer work for the fire service, and a number of San Diego City firefighters to get neurodegenerative diseases added to the presumptive list for California firefighters.
Well, as you just pointed out, with the mandatory overtime, 14 shifts in a month, this is the other part of the cancer conversation, the suicide conversation, and this conversation too. We know that the brain heals itself. It processes memories. It literally restores, you know, the entire brain matter itself when we are asleep. You know, that the bath, the virtual bath that it gets. So this is the other thing that I've always said. If we're talking about presumption, if you work shift work as a firefighter, there's your presumption. Doesn't matter if you're on this fire or that fire, or you saw this deadly wreck, or, you know, that is it. We're asking people to be awake when everyone else is asleep. That in itself is a known, scientifically proven risk factor to all things ill health, including these neurodegenerative illnesses.
I totally agree. Sleep deprivation was always the toughest part of the job for me. Hey, have you had Rob Sweetman on this podcast, the Sleep Genius?
Yeah, he's been on a couple of times now, just recently, right, to promote his Ryan Larkin adventure race a few weeks ago.
Oh, good. So he started put on this program for firefighters, and I was one of the first firefighter cohort programs. I think you'll get a kick out of the story, James. I love Rob's sleep program, 62 Romeo, because it's so focused on sleep hygiene. So part of the program was we get these sleep mats that are sleep sensors, and they're synced to an app on our phone. And they show the 4 stages of sleep, REM sleep, the percentage of time spent in the night, and then it gives you this overall score, 0 to 100, 100 being the best. So the first night I use it is at the station. So you put it under your mattress, and it calibrates to the weight of the mattress and your body weight. So I go to bed that night, 10 or 10:30, and we sleep all night. We don't have any wake ups. I get up 6 in the morning. I'm like, oh yeah, I kicked ass on my sleep last night. Slept all night, opened up my app. Overall sleep quality, bad, 22. And that was on a night that I slept. And that was so eye-opening for me. I'm like, wow, I spent hardly any time in stage 4 REM sleep. I was, sleeping with one eye open. I was so hypervigilant that I still scored a 22. And that was so telling to me of how detrimental sleep loss is to the fire department.
I use the analogy for people that aren't in our profession. Imagine that you lay down in a bed and the person stood next to your bed with those giant cymbals that they use in orchestras. And they say, I may or may not smash these in your ears. How well are you going to sleep? Because that's it. I mean, as we all know, everyone listening, you could wake up and it could be, oh, I've had tummy ache for 5 days. And you're just like, ah. Or it could be multiple calls, structure fire, 2 children trapped in a second floor bedroom. And doesn't matter because you don't know what the next one is coming. You're not going to get into a deep restorative sleep. And even though, technology really can't tell us exactly if we are in those stages of sleep, but it can tell, like you were probably alluding to, are we shifting around? Are we completely still? That gives you an indication of that. But you physically cannot get in that deep restorative sleep, even if, and I never had a goose egg, but I had, some nights where we did sleep through the night. It's not a night's sleep. It's totally different than if you slept in your home and there were no chance of any tones going off, no chance of hearing burping and farting and CPAPs everywhere. It's your actual, but then you're going to get a good night's sleep. And this is why I've flogged the dead horse over and over again with the work week, is if you give these men and women another night in their own bed at home, that is when they're resting and recovering. Whether they run 4 all night or whether they sleep through the night, they're still not getting a solid night's sleep. They were just unconscious in a fire station. So it's those days between the shifts that are so important, which is why I harp on about 24/72. And now there are actually studies beginning that are following pre and post in these departments. So we'll be able to see the science. Of course, you got to be a fucking idiot to not know what the result is going to be. Of course it's better, but some people want to show me the data, so... But when you understand that fallacy of, firefighters sleep all night, even if on those rare occasions you do not get a call between 10 p.m. and, whatever your wake up time is, 6 a.m., you are still not getting the same quality sleep than if you are home away from a fire station.
Yeah. And a lot of firefighters talk about that night before they go back on shift too, of not sleeping well because that anxiety, that hypervigilance, I think the mind preparing for battle, so to speak, like that's a common phenomenon too, is we come to work tired because we didn't sleep well that night before coming in. I think your description of the symbols is so apt. I have a friend that, told his doctors, like, imagine you come in and give you 10 joules to your chest a couple times a night. And the doctor's like, that's crazy. He's like, what an adrenaline dump that is of hearing that alarm. And we've all experienced it, of just going from 0 to 60 and just that immediate dump of adrenaline in our system is going to be catastrophic over time.
Well, the other interesting thing that I will credit Sarah Jenke and Joel Billings for opening this up was the conversation of the start times. When you work a 24-hour shift, that is a dial that you can rotate anyway because you start and finish at the same time. And so some of these researchers, even though they were really neglecting the proper number of hours to work, the study that they did on the 4896, which if you look at it is fucking awful, but the one good thing that they got from their study was people in the very, very quiet department that they studied, where they ran 1 call a shift, basically 0 at night, they saw a lower cortisol, a higher HRV that second 24 hours. And it was because they didn't have to wake up at 5 a.m. and then drive 100 miles to the station to get there by 7. So I think we would alleviate some of that stress. And I think that, 11 a.m. or 12 noon would be perfect. When I worked in Anaheim, I lived in Burbank first. So I went all the way through the city of LA to get to work. Man. And so I'm getting up at 5, with that stressful 70-mile journey, which I did even in Florida here, to get there, to be the good guy that's 30 minutes early so that you get relief before you get hit with another call. Now you shift that to 11 a.m., 12 noon. you sleep in after being murdered all night, so you don't drive home and then end up, a splat on a railway, on a freeway bridge somewhere. And then I wake up, have breakfast with my family, take my kids to school, then head to the station. And that way I've actually seen my family one more morning per tour than I would have been the other way. So that's another, to your point, another part of this conversation that costs $0 is just because we've always gone in at 7 a.m., is that the right time? Because we can choose any time. And some people go, oh, we'll do PM. Well, you got the same problems at night. You've got rush hour at night. You've got not be able to do anything during the day because you're waiting to go to work. So I find that the 11 a.m., 12 noon, coupled with a 24/72, you would eliminate the sleep deprivation and the anxiety the night before the shift. And then you're giving more rest and recovery between shifts. I mean, you're saving money with a 24/72 because you're fully staffed and people want to work for you. So the overtime, the recruitment, the retention costs, the change in time costs you $0, and you've amplified the effects from both sides. So that's a conversation that none of us were thinking about. I certainly wasn't until a few years ago.
Yeah, that'd be super interesting to look into. And you mentioned the 48-96 schedule. We called it the 96-48 because that's what the reality of the forcing was.
Yeah. And then it's not even an opinion. 24 hours is pushing it. That's the bottom line. One night without sleep is pushing it. Then you go home the next morning and you have rest and recovery. So to put two together, and bearing in mind in Anaheim, we did the one-on-one off 4 times with a 4 or 6 day at the end. So I know what it's like to have more days at the end of a cycle, but it's not worth the risks that you take on the way to that. With a 24/72, every single shift, you are getting what's argued at the moment as the enough time to recover for the next one. But in Orange County, in LA, in San Francisco, in Denver, with these men and women are running consistently throughout the shift, it is so unethical, dangerous, and unprofessional to work 48 hours with, as we said, disrupted or no sleep. So, and then they're driving home even more sleep deprived, and then we're wondering why we get all these single vehicle fatalities.
Yeah, we were routinely forced onto 72 and 96-hour shifts. And I know you've talked at length about it, about all the accidents and major accidents, even outside of the fire service, that have happened because of sleep deprivation. And I remember as a young medic driving home and pulling in my driveway and going, I don't think I hit anybody on the way home, but I don't remember getting here. It's like all of a sudden I was just there. Scary.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, I want to round off with one more area and then we'll go to some closing questions. As you were progressing through this, obviously you became more and more versed in the psychedelic space as well, but you were also pursuing counseling. So talk to me about your transition from actually riding a rig to now being another part of the solution in a different occupation.
So once I switched from the hazmat station to the last station I worked at, 59 in San Clemente, I realized I needed a project. Hazmat had a lot going on top of running regular calls. So I saw how important therapy was for me. So I went back to school and got a master's in counseling to become a therapist for police and firefighters and military, because I saw not only the mental health crisis, but how important therapy was. And so I went to school through Concordia University in Irvine. We met as a cohort the first week, the welcome week, and then it was largely online, which was fortunate because then COVID hit. And luckily I was already in school, I was in a routine. And so I had that outlet. And when it came time to do my clinical time, I took a 7-month leave of absence from the fire department because it was just too many shifts to try and balance trading and working. So I just took that time off. And it was right before that time that I was diagnosed with Parkinson's. I did my clinical time at a drug and alcohol rehab clinic that I really enjoyed doing that work. Finished my master's degree, and had shoulder surgery from a training accident that I had put off for 2 years. So finally had shoulder surgery. And it was through doing a medicine ceremony that I watched my own funeral and watched my wife and my kids grieving. And it's kind of weird or hard to describe in the medicine space, but it was kind of like floating over this town while watching my family at my funeral, and just really came to terms with my body cannot do this job anymore. Between the shoulder injuries, the knee injuries, the now Parkinson's disease, my balance starting to be messed up. I didn't trust myself on a ladder or a roof, and I worked on a truck company. I didn't want to be a liability to the guys I was supposed to be leading and fall off the aerial ladder because I have Parkinson's. So I came to terms that I couldn't do this job anymore. I mean, Gabor Mate wrote a very good book called When the Body Says No, and that's what I experienced is my body is saying, no, you cannot do this. And I was fortunate to have Nate there that night facilitating, because Nate had a double knee replacement before he had to retire, and just sitting, like we were sitting back to back against each other, and just having, the love and compassion from him, of him understanding like this is tough, like your career is coming to a close. And it took off from there. And thank God I had another career to transition into. I still had purpose. I still had something I was passionate about. So now I work as an associate therapist and love doing the work, and my hours are far better. I don't get up at night. I'm in charge of my own schedule again. It's been a huge blessing, and I'm fortunate to work in a place, in a practice now that supports psychedelic work and psychedelic research, whereas I had to kind of lead two parallel lives because the psychedelic work was not welcomed into the drug and alcohol rehab because it had a misperception of what this psychedelic medicine could do.
And what's the name of the clinic that you work at now?
I work at a place called Daydream MD in San Diego, and they do ketamine therapy as well. So I help facilitate ketamine groups, and then they do individual ketamine therapy. And ketamine is not technically a psychedelic, but it's shown psychedelic properties in opening this window of change for neuroplasticity, taking you out of yourself, offering alternate perspectives, and being really helpful for suicidal ideation, treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, severe anxiety. Ketamine seems to work as an interrupter or a pivot point for a lot of those things that have been bothering people for a long time. And I think it's a good introduction to the psychedelic space without doing a whole night or a whole weekend or a whole week. It can be very, very effective in helping people.
I've had a few people say either it didn't work or even heard some horror stories, and it seems like the common denominator was in each of those cases they were hooked up to IV ketamine and then kind of left to their own devices, versus someone having them, progress the journey with them, whether it was an actual counselor, whether it was some sort of, guide. Talk to me about the cautions when it comes to ketamine.
I'm glad you bring that up because it's similar to MDMA, even though they're very different classes of medications, but they have addictive qualities, and they have recreational use that people have used, so people can treat them, what I would say, in the wrong way. And I think it's really about the intention. Like, what's your intention of the use of this medicine? Is it to affect change in your life, or is it just to escape or to numb something? And setting and safety are all very important when using psychedelic medications, because they can have hugely detrimental effects. So it has to be a safe setting where you're cared for both psychologically and medically. And then I think music is a big part of the experience in guiding you through these experiences. So in the group work we do in Daydream, it's staffed by 2 nurses and then a therapist. And we do a grounding exercise or a meditation, then go into the journey room. It's set up as a place to journey. It's set up as a supportive environment. They wear the disco headsets where the music is played. And we're there to support them if a difficult piece comes up, or to help them ground themselves or get back to the breath or to the music. And then a really important part of this whole conversation is the work that's done afterwards, what we call integration. And that word gets dropped a lot. And to me, what integration means is taking what you've learned from that journey or that experience and putting it into practice in your daily life. And that may be through meditation, through mindfulness, through exercise, through body work, through yoga. And how are you going to take this big thing that you've learned, or this big experience, or this alternate shift in perspective? What does that look like in the days, weeks, and months to come? And I think working with a therapist or a coach is an important part of that, because you can open up this big trauma or a box that you didn't know was there before. It's like, and what do you do with this? And working with someone to coach you through that, or a therapist, can be enormously beneficial.
Absolutely. Well, what about the coming home project? Talk to me about that.
So Nate Brown, the firefighter that I spoke about before, started this nonprofit agency or organization, and he's been doing medicine work for about the last 10 years. And they've put over 1,000 veterans and first responders through the psychedelic medicine space, with the mission to save warriors, to end veteran suicide, one warrior at a time. And just like me, I think Nate has had this profound effect of losing people to suicide that we've worked with, and wanting to put an end to that, and seeing how effective psychedelic medicine has been in our own lives, in altering our perspective, in reconnecting with ourselves and reconnecting us with our families. Nate has put this program together, and he was put in contact and worked with a place called Rhythmia in Costa Rica that is a medically licensed ayahuasca retreat. And Nate primarily uses ayahuasca for his veteran treatment. So we're excited. We're putting a group of 50 veterans and first responders through their program in September. And thanks to the Bird's Eye View Project, who funded this first group going through, many of those guys are getting sponsored to go through this program at Rhythmia in September. So it's our hope that we'll start putting groups through that program in Costa Rica every 3 to 6 months. And we can do it with larger groups because of the staff and the medical supervision that Rhythmia provides.
I didn't realize that it was Bird's Eye View Project that was helping fund that. And it's my friend Ryan Parrott.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very cool. All right. Well, shifting to the closing questions. The first one, is there a book or are there books that you love to recommend? It can be related to our conversation today or completely unrelated.
Oh, so I love to read. I'm usually reading multiple books at once, so I get them confused. But some I'd like to mention, I think Living Untethered by Michael Singer is good. He wrote The Untethered Soul, but I think Living Untethered is even better about the different heart blocks we can have and working with our past. I think he's a beautiful writer. In the psychedelic space, there's a doctor named Joe Tafur who I think has done some really interesting work. He was or is a medical doctor, did his residency at UC San Diego, but he also has Colombian roots, so went down and became a shaman in Colombia. So he's done a lot of work on East meets West and South American culture and the American culture coming together in both medicine, Western medicine, and Southern psychedelic medicine, and how that's come together. So he wrote Fellowship of the River, and then his latest book, Medicine Song, is very good as well. And then a book that I also wanted to mention is called Coddywampling by Kevin Rainey. And Kevin Rainey organizes all our integration services for the Coming Home Project. And Coddywampling is just a really beautiful book about self-discovery and his path and the people he met along the way. And he's just an incredible writer, and it's just a wonderful book to read. So I'd encourage people to go to his website and get a hold of that book.
Brilliant. Some titles I haven't heard before, so thank you. What about documentaries, TV shows, or films that you love?
I knew you were going to ask this question, so I was going to go back. Just a movie that I've always enjoyed since a young age is Heat with Robert De Niro and Al Pacino, and it's kind of the classic good guy bad guy story. But I'm always fascinated at good versus evil, and I like that movie because the good guys have some bad parts about them, and the bad guys have some bad parts about them, and I always kind of like that yin and the yang, and just opposite stories. That just a fun, entertaining movie that I've always enjoyed. So maybe, and there's a classic scene of Al Pacino and Robert De Niro meeting each other in the coffee shop and having that one-on-one conversation, which I think is just a really cool piece of cinema.
Absolutely. A great film. Well, speaking of great people, is there a person you'd recommend to come on this podcast as a guest to speak to the first responders, military, and associated professions of the world?
I've got a few for you. Is that all right?
Yep, absolutely.
So Nate Brown, for sure. He's a great storyteller. He grew up in New Hampshire, so he's got a little bit of a Boston accent. Great storyteller, tremendous human being, very passionate for veterans and first responders and the work he's doing now. Also on the board with him is Brett Odom, who used to be a fighter jet pilot and now is the CFO of the Coming Home Project. And he has a really good story about his journey. And then David Romero on the board. David is very knowledgeable with psychedelics, has a military background as well. And I'd say one more is Kevin Vance. Kevin worked with Nate and I. Kevin and Nate knew each other from the SEAL teams. Kevin went on, he's also retired OCFA. Kevin went on and got a master's, I believe, in spirituality and psychedelics from UC Berkeley. Super intelligent guy, doing some really cool work up in Northern California with psychedelic medicine and research up there. So you wanted one, and I gave you four because those guys are all doing a lot of work in helping in veteran and first responder suicide.
They all sound amazing. So thank you. I'll have to work on getting them on the show. The last question before we make sure everyone knows where to find you and the organizations we've talked about. What do you do to decompress?
Well, I'm doing one of my favorite things to decompress next week is getting up in the mountains. I like hike, bike, fish, but my family goes up to a spot in the high Sierras every year. It's just a slice of heaven, and there's no Wi-Fi, there's no cell service, so the kids are off their devices. Nobody can get a hold of me. It's just my family. I have an old work friend coming up. My dad's coming up, and just exploring heaven on earth. So big on the outdoors, big on getting out in nature is where I feel connected to God and where I feel very high on life.
Fantastic. It's amazing how many times nature is the first thing when I ask this question. And, you go back to COVID, for example, and everyone told to stay in their house and don't question anything and don't see people that you love and, don't get sunshine and don't get fresh air. And, we wonder why there was a massive mental health crisis, that was spawned by that. So, yeah. And again, when we're looking at protecting our air and, our wilderness and our national parks, this is why it's so important, because this is instrumental in the individual mental health and the communities.
I totally agree, and that's why I got my family up to Montana as soon as I could in 2020 and during COVID. But yeah, that is one very good thing about our government is all the protected land that we do have and the work that John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt and some of the people that came before us did in developing national parks and national forests. I'm super thankful for that.
Absolutely. All right. For people listening, let's start with Daydream MD. Where can they find that?
You can go to daydreammd.com and there's a link to my bio on there. Or you can go to kelly.lucas@daydreammd.com and email me.
And then what about the Coming Home Project?
Coming Home Project is thecominghomeproject.org. There's another organization in San Francisco, but I think they're .net. So make sure you go to the .org, and then you can email me at kelly.lucas@thecominghomeproject.org. And I'd encourage people to go to the Instagram page for the Coming Home Project. There's a lot of good testimonials on there, a lot of good stories, and that's the best way to get in contact with us as well.
Well, I want to thank you. I mean, there have been so many facets to this conversation today. We've gone philosophical in some areas, and then, your own courageous vulnerability, talking about your mental health journey and, the Parkinson's diagnosis. But I'm sure people listening are going to be moved not only by, your experiences, but the solutions that you found that you volunteer with or work with now as well. So I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time and coming on the Behind the Shield podcast today.
Thank you, James. And I just want to add, I very much appreciate the work that you continue to do. You've done this for over a decade now with the podcast, but even outside the podcast of what a positive influence you are on the fire department, the police departments, the military, and just overall mental health and well-being of the men and women that we work with. So thank you for what you do. I think it's deeply needed, and you are a force multiplier for what matters most in taking care of people. So thank you.